Let's now turn to a reality that is taking policymakers back to the drawing board. You probably know about the Millennium Development Goals that are meant to make the world a better place by next year. Well, a new UN report is now warning that the poorest people in the world have actually become poorer in the last few years. KTN's Joe Ageo is just back from a special meeting called to discuss ways of saving Africa from the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Across the country on this day, an air of love and seeming bliss. But according to experts, the state of the pocket in the country is not as rosy.
The gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing.
That is because the country's economy is growing, but the poorest Kenyans are yet to feel the trickle down. A recent report by the Society for International Development, SID, laid it bare. For instance, in Turkana County, more than 90% of the population lives on less than 100 shillings a day. That is 4 times higher than the figure in Nairobi, which stands at just under 22%. According to that same report, only 3% of Turkana residents have secondary education or higher. Compare that with 51% in Nairobi, and it comes to more than 15 times the Turkana figure. And that picture of inequality is replicated all around the country.
Those who live in the poorest regions, seeing their circumstances getting worse and worse, and others who are not them getting wealthier and more powerful. Chances are that they do not identify themselves as part of the broader society.
If you look in areas where there is conflict, they are largely countries that you would say there are large pockets of poor people.
But now it's emerging that all across Africa, most poor people are struggling to keep their heads above the water. Even the UN that came up with ambitious targets in the year 2000, known as Millennium Development Goals, is beginning to have a rethink. That just meeting general targets may not do.
If you say the number of primary school enrollment has gone up 90%, what kind of primary school? What kind of education? What kind of teachers with what level of qualification?
UN agencies on the continent are now preparing for a critical conference convened by the government of Ghana to find ways of making economic growth more even. With this meeting that just ended in Addis Ababa as a first step.
Given the context in Africa right now, where you have growth that is not inclusive, that has not created jobs, where you have conflict generated around issues of identity and exclusion, that the conversation is not purely about dealing with the symptoms of inequality or manifestations of inequality, but to address the root causes.
A lot will depend in terms of participation on the ordinary people who are either exploited or excluded themselves. They have to make a claim, they have to make demands, they have to organize themselves to assert those demands.
Now from the west to the east, the story appears to be the same, that of a widening gap between the rich and the poor. And many experts are now warning that creating wealth alone will not lift the continent out of poverty. Joe Ageo, KTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.